So, my standard disclaimer, in spite of my affiliation, these are my personal views. I don't represent Department of Defense, Department of Navy, or the Naval War College. And I'm happy to be here. The Naval War College has a similar mission as the World Affairs Councils do. We're one of about a dozen intermediate and senior level professional military education schools in the U.S. We have officers from all 6 military services, to include the Space Force, and officers from about 70 countries. And so, and they're similar schools, and for the Army, pays the salary in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, Air Force is in Montgomery, but we're all integrated and we're all joint, because that's kind of the world we live in today. As we think about, how the U.S. defense posture is, and maybe we get a preview here in a couple hours with the State of the Union address going forward. But our general approach to defense is really peace through strength. And so I think the strength and peace comes through organizations like the World Affairs Council, because it is about those personal connections and the bonds that we form with each other that I think really makes the United States great. And one of the unique, I won't say truly unique, because I know other countries do similar things, but certainly one of the great countries in the world. What I did want to talk, though, tonight about, and this has been a challenge for me because I spent 5 years writing a book with a computer scientist who's not here tonight. And so Dr. Allen, she's the senior computer scientist. So if we get into technical questions, I'm gonna defer to her on these questions. And she runs an amazing program over at the college that's really connecting community college students with the state and different levels of government for cybersecurity. And I think I told the students, I'm like, keep going, because there is something like 500,000 to 750,000 open jobs in cybersecurity today in the United States. And so it's an area that touches everything that we do when it comes to cyber, to life, I would say. No exaggeration. I think we've kind of shed where we'd use adjectives about something is e-learning, or I don't think anyone says e-shopping or e-commerce anymore. You just shop. I don't quite understand anymore, like Black Friday, Cyber Monday. I think I'm on Amazon. At least someone in my household's on Amazon daily, if not hourly. So it's been very integrated, and so tonight I'm probably going to show some things that are a little scary, but my default answer is, in spite of it all, we're still shopping, banking, traveling, engaging, and so that the defenders just have to stay one step ahead of the attackers. But there are a lot of attackers. And then the good or badness of all of this is it's largely a self-help system in the United States. And I'll talk about some of the limits in terms of who's responsible for cybersecurity. It's very different than sort of other aspects of either physical security, where we would dial 911 and police would be there, or national security, where the Defense Department and Department of State, Treasury, Commerce are engaged in promoting national security. Okay. So first, Kathy Johnson, who invited me, sort of said, well, right, the audience will be mixed understanding. So just to get us all on the same page, what is cyberspace? And so at least the Defense Department definition I offer you really focuses on, it's a communication network. And almost all communications these days are digital. And so, the copper wire, I don't know if you still have copper wire running into your house. Most cable companies are replacing that with fiber and digitizing. If you use a cell phone, right, that's digitized and it's going out right through the electromagnetic spectrum. And so the internet's fundamentally a communication network, is a way to think about it. But it's much more than in the book, my colleague, he insisted we put in an image of 2 people with tin cans, because that's what communication used to be like 100 years ago. If you can imagine, right, or remember the switchboard and the switchboard operator. It was point-to-point communication, just like those 2 strings. And in the 1960s, there was a goal to decentralize communications, and there's a debate on whether or not it was to ensure communications would survive a nuclear attack during the height of the Cold War. But regardless, the Defense Department funded a program that was called ARPA-NET, Advanced Research Program Agency Network, and then it becomes DARPA-NET, Defense Advanced Research Program Agency Network, and then it kind of splits off in the 80s to become NSF-NET, National Science Foundation Network, and MILNET, Military Network. I'm doing well, so if I forget to define an acronym, just raise your hand. I'm doing my best. And then it becomes the internet because it commercializes in the 1990s, and that's where Dr. Allen and I were living the old days of we'd get AOL CDs in the mail to try to connect up to AOL. To now, right? It just seems silly, but it developed, and there's kind of a few dimensions I think as I think of cyberspace. So there is the physical part of it. There's the hardware piece, networks, servers. Right, our laptop that we're running. I've got this wireless mouse, and so the data. So it's just using a radio frequency to flip a slide for me. There's the data, the media, right, the stuff we care about, and then there's kind of the people dimension, the cognitive, and so what I would say, this also parallels a little bit of where the field I think has gone. That originally we thought about, when we talk cybersecurity, it was probably mostly physical. Protecting data centers, networks, controlling access, who logs on to what privileges. And then it was about data, right? Protecting your intellectual property, protecting your secrets. And then I think lately it's been about how people interpret things and the cognitive influences. And so we're in an election year, and I'll sort of dwell a little bit. Unsurprising, foreign intelligence services will attempt to influence the outcome of the upcoming presidential election. How do I know? They did so in 2020. They did so in 2016. So they will do so in 2024. So some basic features. First, it transcends boundaries. So normally, I think a lot about national security, but I also say national security is really internationalized not national, but if we're to pull up a map, we can sort of figure out the boundaries of the United States or Canada. Cyberspace sort of defies that logic because it was designed to be highly decentralized, and data doesn't necessarily move in the shortest distance. It moves in the least congested manner, is how it's dynamic. It was created in 1969, and so only 55 years ago, and it continues to grow. 55 years ago, if you talk to somebody about ARPANET, it was just 4 universities connected in San Diego, Los Angeles, Salt Lake City, and Stanford. And then that's just a partial snapshot. And if you think about your home network, maybe you have back in the day, right, you just sort of had a PC with a line going into it, and now maybe you still have that because you didn't, recycle it, but you probably have a wireless router, you probably have some tablets, you probably have phones, maybe you have some light bulbs, maybe a refrigerator, you have different things, and that's what I mean by dynamic, right? We've moved a long way from just sort of having a desktop and one line, and it just continues to grow, and there are more and more uses for it, and things have gotten faster and faster, and the speed enables things like autonomous driving, because the data speed is no longer a concern. Now, I enjoy driving, so I don't really understand the appeal, but some people don't like driving. So the idea of autonomy, is kind of coming, but there's a lot of risk. Easy to entry, right? Devices, I think, also have gotten a lot simpler, to use. There is no longer, there is kind of an on and off switch, but the software has just gotten really good and extremely user-friendly. Even we think about if you're on a tablet or a phone, right? They're apps. You don't even have to type in a URL locator anymore. You can just tap on something. And then even as we start thinking about the future with generative AI, and if you sort of haven't played around with, either the Bing, the Microsoft search engine, or there's a free version of OpenAI, ChatGPT. It's no longer about search to find things, it's about search for answers, or it's questions to provide answers. And a lot of use cases for this. I mean, it's, one of my assistants, she did it. She wanted to learn Spanish within a year. So she went to ChatGPT and said, design a Spanish language program, so I can become fluent at this level in 12 months, and gave a schedule. And of course, we know I'm a teacher, and so we see students try to use it. It's too general still. I'll admit to, as a professor, I've tried to use it to grade. Doesn't work. You still need, that's what I thought would be the great equalizer. Professors are up in arms because students are using it. If we could use it to grade, then I think we would find some detente with that. But in certain fields, AI works really well. I like to think about AI. It does well with sort of the dull, the dangerous, the dirty, and the dollars. And so the dull, for example, would be it's really good at image recognition. And so, these are my personal views, but back when I was in the Navy, there's a program called Project Maven, and it's all about, the U.S. government collects a lot of imagery, so photography data and such. It's boring. It's extremely dull to look at that. But you can, there are programs now that you can just look at it. And so the same thing like if you're using on your phone, like your Apple Photos, it'll group it by face. That's what it does. You don't have to look through your 10,000 photos to find that picture of you. It'll group it by face. That's what I mean by the dull. The dangerous, the military's using it to, go into combat zones, and you're not risking human beings anymore. And so it's going into that. The dirty, in terms of pollution and such, you can send in robots, right, which are autonomous or semi-autonomous, and put them in dirty situations. You don't want to put human beings. And then the dollars, every organization on the planet is trying to figure out how to become more cost efficient, and AI can help. And so there's a lot of promise with that. Generally easy to do, it's getting easier. The US, this was created in the US with, and certainly I would say grew up in Europe as well. The World Wide Web was invented in Europe at CERN, the nuclear lab. I don't know if it was the first or one of the very first browsers was created at Urbana-Champaign Mosaic, the first. And that was kind of a precursor to Netscape. And nobody uses Netscape anymore, so I don't know what became of Netscape. But so if you think about Safari or Microsoft Edge, it was invented, how far away are we from Urbana?
90 miles.
90 miles, okay, so 90 miles down the road. And so that's a good thing. Military uses it, US certainly, but every military in the world is using it as an enabler in all sorts of different ways. So either helping with recognition of things, helping make sense of things. And then fundamentally, I'll sort of throw out too, it's a civilian space. This is where we shop, this is where we socialize, this is where we bank. And so I think we have to be extremely careful to make sure we don't mess that up. That the internet should be for everybody. And this is a concern of some of the founders that were involved, is that it does get militarized or it just gets overly commercialized, and we sort of lose what the original vision was for. So how did this become a topic? I mean, is sort of, I've been increasingly interested in, like, why is this even interesting? Hopefully you find it interesting. If not, the meal was good, so thank you for that. I think all the cake is gone. But so first, there's probably some seminal mega breaches, that have occurred and some unique things. So Target, a mega breach, and so Target did everything right on its network. But the hackers went in through their HVAC system. They didn't go through the Target system because companies, they're diverse, right? You have heating and air conditioning. You certainly have water. You have other dimensions to your company. And so Target was breached actually through an HVAC system. And it cost about $200 million. Their chief information officer ended up resigning. So there was some boardroom shakeup. The one that affected more of us probably is Equifax. So this is one of the credit agencies. And so Equifax was breached, 140 million people were social security numbers, credit history compromised. The CEO ended up resigning over that. And as me, because my personal data was compromised, I get lifetime free credit monitoring on that one. And then kind of the bigger one, NotPetya, and this was a $10 billion impact. And this was a case of Russia and Ukraine have been rivals for a bit. Russia first invades Ukraine in 2014, and so what we saw 8 years later was just an escalation. And so Russia had infected some accounting software that Ukraine was using to gain access to that. But because other companies around the world use it, it affected global shipping giant Maersk had to shut down operations. I know FedEx slowed things. And so this really sort of, to me, this issue illustrates how integrated all of these networks are, right? Something that you would think of, right, war between Russia and Ukraine should be isolated, but this affected the world. And then the Canadian version of this too is Desjardins, a bank in at least Quebec, is just a malicious insider. So we often think too, cybersecurity, right? It could be right Russian hackers, or North Korean hackers out of Macau, but its insider is a real danger as well. And this created a whole different dimension and different lessons. The first couple on the target was you have to know who's on your network, HVAC. Equifax, you really had to look at it was a website vulnerability. How is your website secure? And then on the NotPetya, you really had to look at how software is connected. And then this one, Desjardins, was about insiders. And so you have to think about not only outside perimeter, but also who's inside and monitoring what's going on. I mean, there's kind of a funny story with, it's not even funny, but when China hacked the Office of Personnel Management, and this is why I get free credit monitoring for life, is that anybody that had gotten a security clearance since they digitized records, and it was millions of people, all their data were stolen by the Chinese government. And what's funny about the story is when they took the data out, they encrypted it because they thought that's how that data moved. And in fact, that was one of the signs that, somebody's on our network that shouldn't be because they normally don't encrypt that data. And so that led to really thinking more about what's going on, not only who's on your network, but what are they doing and such. So the national security end, I'll try to go a little faster, but some points. So my disclaimer is we spent 5 years on this book. The book is available, Security in the Cyber Age, and so there's more to all of these stories. But the first big one in 2007, Estonia was taken down. So imagine you go to the bank, your ATM card doesn't work. You go to Amazon, you can't buy anything. You want to get married, you can't register. You have a child, you can't get a birth certificate. That's what happened for 22 days. Why? Because Estonia took down a Russian military statue and Russians retaliated. And Estonia was a NATO member at that point. And Estonia went to the North Atlantic Council and said, hey, we've been attacked, help. And NATO at the time in 2007, they're like, well, were you really attacked? What happened? I see you couldn't use your stuff. How sure are you it's Russia? And that was sort of the logic. And the president at the time was Tom Ilves. He grew up in the United States in Philadelphia, went back after the Soviet Union fell, helped, country, president, right, became president, and all of that. And so 7 years later, though, NATO now will say a cyber attack that is the equivalent of a physical attack can be interpreted as a use of force. And so that becomes kind of important. The physical one is a good one in Iran. Its nuclear facility was attacked, and this was a case of malware, software, causing physical destruction of nuclear centrifuges. And that was in 2010. In 2014, North Korea attacked Sony Pictures Entertainment, which you might say, who cares, over this movie, The Interview. And I'll give you, I pulled a quote from President Obama because he dealt with this and really, saw it as a free speech attack. Right, hitting at the heart. And then in 2015, a power plant in Ukraine was shut down for about a day. And again, it was through malware. And the latter, so that's kind of the devastating fear that everyone is concerned about, is computers. If you can imagine factories, people would go, right, you'd turn, right, valves and dials. That can all be computerized now with industrial controlled systems. It's enabled enormous scalability, but it's created some new vulnerabilities. And kind of bring us up to date, so the big cyber challenge, so the U.S., our Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, she testified that last year during her annual testimony that if Beijing feared a major conflict with the U.S. were imminent, it almost certainly would consider undertaking aggressive cyber operations against U.S. homeland, critical infrastructure. And so this is important for a number of reasons. One, right, U.S. and China are rivals. The U.S. recognizes it, so does China. So it's not a case of the U.S. sort of beating the drum. Two, what intrigues me about this challenge is, typically how we've conceived of U.S. national security is we fight the wars over there, so you don't here in the homeland have to be affected by it. And that's been true since, probably, right, Pearl Harbor, if we count Hawaii as a territory, Japan attacking. Before that, you have to stretch your imagination about Pancho Villa invading from Mexico. And then before that, you got to go back to the War of 1812. Life in North America has been calm and peaceful for people, right, civilians. And the president deploys military internationally. Cyber changes all that. So that's kind of the bad news for us all, is we're in the crosshairs now. And you shut down the power. You could look at the impact of that after a major storm when you lose power, and that's what it looks like. Supply chains are really disrupted, right? The warehousing isn't there anymore, and so things can go bad pretty quickly. The cognitive impact, so my favorite part of this story, so this again, Iranian President then Ahmadinejad walking through the centrifuge array. And he's very proud, right? Iran's very proud of its nuclear program, and so what was happening is they were seeing the destruction of these centrifuges, but if you're in the control room, all your gauges looked right, and so it was really affecting how people thought. And then some managers were fired until they figured out, oh, this is malware. So there can be a cognitive impact. Probably more specific for us. So these are two national intelligence estimates that you can go to the Office of Director of National Intelligence, odni.gov, to get the reports. But basically note that in the 2016 election, Russia targeted the election, did its best to, because they assumed Hillary Clinton was going to win, not Donald Trump. And so they attacked the DNC, Democratic National Committee headquarters, to get what they thought would be damaging information. And if you remember, the chair at the time, Debbie Wasserman Schultz from Florida, ended up resigning after some of the the embarrassing stuff came out, and because they really wanted to just undermine Clinton's presidency, so did the same thing in 2020. And it has the effect of undermining faith and trust and confidence in democracy. And so, one of the things, again, too, kind of like where I sit, we often think about, or it's harder to think about weakening. So if you're asking, well, what are China and Russia's motivations? It's really to weaken the United States. It's not to defeat the United States. It's just to weaken it. And the strength that they view of the United States is really the community, the democracy, and then going after things like this has an important impact. There is a physicalness to it all. The world is wrapped in transoceanic cables, and so the U.S. is very closely monitoring. To some extent, the oceans are gigantic. But you probably maybe get a headline in the last couple of weeks, the cables between, going through the Red Sea, connecting Europe and the Middle East, those have been disrupted, and about 20% of internet traffic. I think the good news, on this, once the space-based constellations are up, so you hear about a lot Skylink or Starlink, and I think there's about 6,000 or 8,000 satellites up right now. Amazon has their Project Kuiper, and they'll do the same thing. So there'll be a lot of redundancy. This is, if you're global, right? If you're a global company, you rely on this thing. Self-censorship, so, again, attacking the heart of democracy. The cybersecurity challenge created through this is when we know, and I'll offer a couple examples. Here's an editorial board of, I think it's a journal, Wall Street Journal, talking about just Chinese threat to American speech. The idea that if you do business in China, you can't say the 3 T's, Tiananmen, Taiwan, or Tibet. And in fact, they were putting out, we're not supposed to say Tibet anymore. They've come up with a Chinese version of what Tibet is and the idea of erase Tibet as an independent nation. And so here's my Obama quote. This is tied to North Korea shutting down Sony. Quote, "We cannot have a society in which some dictators someplace can start imposing censorship here in the United States. Because if somebody is able to intimidate us out of releasing a satirical movie, imagine what they start doing once they see a documentary they don't like or news reports that they don't like. That's not who we are. That's not what America is about." And that's how President Obama interpreted the attack against Sony. Is really getting at the heart of it. So it's not just simply, in the mega breach examples that I used of, well, right, your credit data, is compromised or, billions lost. It's also sort of just the very nature of the United States is vulnerable through cybersecurity. Trolling, and so another example, in the last group I asked any Rockets fans and I got no response, but here's a case. The Houston Rockets general manager, he retweeted, this is when in 2019, when there was the umbrella revolution in Hong Kong, Hong Kong trying to preserve some democratic rights from mainland China. He just simply retweeted, quote, "Fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong." And then his account on Twitter at the time was just overwhelmed, and he ended up having to resign. NBA sort of was, they got blocked in China for a little bit, and China's a gigantic market, so they didn't want that. But what's sort of interesting, and I dwelled on this with the cybersecurity students from Lincoln Land College, is they were all fake accounts. This is the problem, with the internet. You don't know who is anybody, is a reality. And so about 50% of these accounts, they had like 0 to 12 followers, which means they probably weren't real. And so it kind of goes back to, if you think about how we sort of validate each other, it's nice right here, we all had name tags, so we all knew we had to be here. And then we have, right, nice board member, so I know, right, Lynn, she's a board member, and we have that. But in cyberspace, we don't have that same level of digital identity for a lot of different reasons. There's a huge human security threat to this as well. Only about 18% of the world's population experiences the internet like we do as Americans. That in many parts of the world, governments use the internet as a tool for censorship and control. And so, I keep getting asked the question, and you will too, because I was saying that the acronym is FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Can I really shop at Amazon anymore? Yes, you can. But the idea is, the U.S. government's not involved in cyberspace for a lot of reasons, and in some cases, countries, the example, you go to China, you can't look at the New York Times; it's blocked. If you were to use what's called a virtual private network, basically says, the neat thing about the internet and cyberspace is time travel exists, so I can use the Wayback Machine and see what a web page looked like 15 years ago. Teleportation exists through a virtual private network. So I can say, if I'm sitting here in Springfield, but I don't want anyone to know that online, I can say I'm in New York, I can say I'm in Dubai. That's a VPN. It's illegal in China and Russia and such. So this becomes important because part of the U.S. International agenda is internet freedom. The U.S. does have in the Department of State an ambassador to cyberspace. He leads the Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital something. And Nate Fick, an amazing person as the ambassador. And so they're out there trying to promote a free, open cyberspace and work with other governments to try to bring more security. Okay, so that's all the bad stuff mostly, right? So let me talk a little bit about policy, and then we'll get to your questions. The reason government is largely absent, first, it's largely private. That it's the telecom, and private I'm going to just use as non-governmental. So they could be privately held companies, it could be publicly traded companies. It's really not the government. And so it's the telecom providers, your cable company, your phone service, it's Microsoft, it's Apple, it's Cisco, it's Amazon Web Services, and so this complicates it. Government does own airspace. Government does own land borders. Government does own maritime borders. Government does not own cyberspace. And so that complicates any time government wants to get involved. The second point, though, is government increasingly sees it as a tool of power. And so just like we think about diplomacy, going to negotiate a treaty or build support for an ally as a tool of power, so is cyberspace operations. So the US does, we have a cyber command. Dozens of countries have cyber commands too. The hard thing too is, when a missile is launched, I can tell you where it was launched from. And because of the amazing power of geometry, we can tell you, or trigonometry, this is my math skills in front of the professor. Trigonometry, so I can tell you where that's going to go. Within a minute of launch, and so I could say, yeah, there's probably only one purpose. If I'm tracking a North Korean missile and it's heading to Okinawa, where there are U.S. Marines in Okinawa, Japan, I kind of know what's going on. But if I detect North Korean hackers on my server, what are they doing? Are they trying to learn? Are they trying to corrupt? Are they laying, the equivalent of sort of logic bombs, so in the event they want to do something, they turn it on? It's hard to know. And that's where there's a lot of ambiguity in terms of understanding intention that doesn't exist in sort of traditional national security. Internet's largely global, but as I sort of said or hinted to anyway, governments are increasingly engaged in trying to regulate. This was the hardest chapter I think I had to conceptualize because I couldn't figure out what does it mean when the government of Vietnam says any data on Vietnamese citizens must be kept in Vietnam, data localization. What does it mean for the US government to say we want to ban TikTok? What does it mean for the Chinese government to say we want Made in China 2025? They don't want Microsoft. They want some other operating system. And finally, I came up with the word, or remembered the word regulation. And it's really governments are regulating in cyberspace. And they do it. Some are extremely restrictive. In the US, it's largely at what frequency devices can operate. In China, it's what words you can use. In Russia, it's what software you can use. And even a large democracy like India will turn off parts of the internet at times because of domestic unrest and whatnot. So it's just not authoritarian countries. So this is kind of one of the challenge for governments is we, the general US position is free, unfettered, open, but the rest of the world doesn't necessarily agree. At the federal level, you can find online the National Cybersecurity Strategy, and I really I'll short fuse it a little bit, say it's a team sport. No one individual is in charge. Theoretically, we have a new office, the ONCD, Office of National Cyber Director, created in law in 2020, confirmed for the first time April 2021, which maybe should be startling that we've only had a national cyber director for like 2 years. And you think you would want someone sooner than that, but it's only been around 2 years. The one below it, CISA, that was created in 2018. That's the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency. They were created after the Russian election interference in 2016. But if you sort of look at CISA, great organization led by a great person, Jen Easterly. They're really there, to help and provide guidelines. They don't provide cybersecurity. They offer advice, they offer services, and so a great organization. But as the old saying is, it's a free country. Government's not telling people what to do on these questions. Some of the positive responses, the U.S. government has done everything from indict sitting Russian intelligence officers. You can go to the FBI webpage, and that's more signaling. That's more, hey, we know you're doing this, we don't like it. In the more extreme version, we'll shut down consulates. The U.S. government shut down consulates after the 2016 election. There was a Russian consulate in San Francisco, shut it down. On a kind of positive note, when I started out in the intel community way back when, NSA, the joke was it was called no such agency because it was not publicly acknowledged. And then all of a sudden, the head of NSA Cyber, Rob Joyce, you can follow him on Twitter, NSA Cyber, he gives a TED Talk that basically says, I will tell you how to prevent me from hacking on your network. And it's a wonderful talk. And his point is like, look, if I'm not going to try to hack your network. B, I can still hack your network because they're NSA top-notch level hackers. But what this tool Ghidra is they've put out in public now. So there are public releases. So companies and organizations know, if there are cybersecurity advisories that they need to patch or change behavior. There was one a couple weeks ago where a certain router that moves internet traffic, they said, if you have it, turn it off because it was compromised. And then this tool, Ghidra, you can reverse engineer malware, bad software, and such. So that's kind of the big, I know I covered a lot, but like I said, it was sort of like 5 years, 350-page book. We've done about a half a dozen podcasts, so hopefully that's enough to get you interested in the topic and ask some questions as we go from there. And remember, the hard ones, it's Dr. Allen. Yeah. Oh, you did have a question? Okay.
Is the occurrence of cybersecurity breaches what drives cyber policy?
I think so. I think it's usually failure, that policy tends to lag failure, and I think that's almost always true. You fight the last war, and so I think in the case of, I think the example I used in one of the talks was, CISA was created to secure elections and really electronic polling and data security. No one was thinking about influence operations. And then you look at the big challenge today is really ransomware. That wasn't on government's radar when CISA was created. And you see, ransomware, it's a multi-billion-dollar criminal enterprise now. And the big one that's in the news the last couple of days, United Health, their payment system. So, hopefully you're getting reimbursed. But the story I heard on NPR on the drive down, is something like 25% of healthcare professionals who use this are tapping into their cash reserves. And so ransomware just wasn't on anyone's list. And so, when people say like, what's next? I'm like, I don't know, but I know we're not thinking about it. And so it is a case, but I would say, you still have to secure against influence operations. You still have to secure against insiders. You still have to, because the attackers just look for the weakest link. And you see with, towns and municipalities, there's been a lot, I don't know, in Illinois, the big one a couple of years ago, all these small towns in Texas got held hostage. They couldn't collect property tax. They couldn't pay their vendors. And so you just shut down government operations, or probably I think what happened with, at the start of the Biden administration. So SolarWinds, which was a Russian foreign intelligence hack revealed in the December before he was inaugurated, and also the Microsoft Exchange server hack was revealed in the same month, but by China. They come in January. Their first crisis is Colonial Pipeline, where you had on the East Coast, so it was a big deal for me because I'm in Rhode Island, and Colonial Pipeline, which is a privately held company, their IT system was compromised through ransomware out of an abundance of caution. So the stuff that actually moved the fuel is called operational technology, OT. We think it's fine. but they couldn't bill and they didn't know what was compromised. And so for like 10 days, there were jet fuel shortages, I think, in Philly hit in most particular, and starting to look at. So they weren't thinking about that. So the Biden administration they started with ransomware, and the deputy for National Cyber Director, Kimball Walden, she's an attorney. She was a Microsoft attorney. She sort of ran to counter ransomware there, and she went into government to be the deputy to help deal with these problems. So yeah, I guess it lags. Policy lags. Yes. Yes.
Regarding ransomware, is there help that the federal government gives to companies who are undergoing situations like that? And is that help in combating it? Is it help in paying off what's required to get companies back running?
No, it's a great question, and I'm going to do a little head bob because it depends. So typically how it's discovered is, most companies will, they'll have their traditional, information security operations or IT department. And then in the event of a breach, they'll typically have a retainer with a cybersecurity company like CrowdStrike. And so I'll use the Democratic National Committee hack as an example. Is DNC gets hacked, they call in CrowdStrike. CrowdStrike helps with mitigation and recovery. And then CrowdStrike says, hey, I think it would be a good idea if you called the FBI. It's up to the organization to whether they want to bring the government in. Now, the exception, so in December, just a few months ago, the Securities and Exchange Commission, a new rule, it required if it's a publicly traded company, they have to report the breach within 4 days. I think the government policy is still don't pay ransoms because you just give criminals more resources. Crime pays, stop paying. But I think the reality is companies pay ransoms and the government doesn't prosecute. So that's why I'm not quite sure on the legality. I know they don't encourage paying ransom, but I think it is one of those practical matters. But so that's publicly traded companies. Now again, I'm trying to get the students I don't think it's a great idea you report in 4 days. And you might say, why? Nothing to do with the company's reputation. Is oftentimes you might detect the vulnerability, but they might have been on your network for years. And so you got to get them off, and then the vulnerability they exploited is probably still out there. And so this is where Microsoft or Oracle for Java would have to develop a patch. And so that's the one thing I don't like is sort of that advertising. But it hasn't been enough time to get terribly excited about this yet to see how it goes, because that was only in December. Sir?
Particularly since we're in an election year, I haven't been able to get my arms around yet this whole notion of election interference and how that happens and where it happens. Can you talk a little bit about that and things we might anticipate, and how can us as ordinary folks know what's going on and understand what's happening?
Yeah, so probably, in an exquisite way would be you identify battleground districts and battleground states, and then maybe you disrupt it some way, power outages, something like that. That would probably be the most exquisite, and you can do that, right? We have very close elections, as you know. And so you could probably figure out what are those key districts to kind of focus on.
Has that happened before?
I don't know. No, not in the power outage way. That would be the exquisite. I mean, where we've kind of been, I think, is more just sort of, undermine faith and trust in democracy. And so we're already at voter turnout at 50% or so. And again, that would be the other. Just, get it lower and then help mobilize the other side. And governments show, right, foreign governments, I mean, U.S. might be the exception. Like, I don't think we care per se who wins. I don't know what the next, in India, I think is having an election this year. I don't know if we care, like as individual citizens, do we care whether Modi is reelected or not? I don't think so, but most people around the world care whether it's Trump or Biden. And their governments care too, and they try to influence the process.
How would that happen? That's what I'm trying to get.
Yeah, so it could be, right, so.
Keep voter turnout.
Yeah.
Social media.
Social media, and Well, so the example that's kind of unfolding, so the allegations on the on Biden's son and a laptop, it looks like it's turning out to be like a Russian intelligence operation. So you're undermining the credibility of the president through this investigation, and that's still sort of unfolding. And the FBI sort of revealed a couple weeks ago, I think. So that would be an example. That undermine the credibility, complicate, false stories. Often happens. We're not seeing it in our election, but at least in Ukraine, for example, Russia keeps putting out, the U.S. has bioweapons labs in Ukraine, and we invented COVID. And so it would be, cases like that. Just unmotivate people so they don't go to the polls. And if you can figure out what group you want to unmotivate to go to the polls, because people don't vote equally. So let's say you're pro Trump, you just it's not necessarily get out the Trump vote. You just keep some Biden voters home, and so figure out what there in Russia and China. There are just buildings filled with people who that's their job, is to sort of undermine the credibility of the U.S. and by doing so tie it to the president. But one of the advantages the U.S. has from other systems, there's about 3,000 voting entities in the U.S., and so you can't really manipulate totals like people thought way back when, because there isn't, we don't vote at the national level, right? We vote at our district level and then the state level, and if you add that up in the U.S., it's about 3,000 sort of voting districts or whatever we call them. Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah.
When ARPA put together this communication tool, one has to remember that the power of the computer wasn't like it has on the phone right now. Yeah. What I would be interested to know is if people that were involved in that particular project for the agency sit around and say, what have we created? Unleashed,
yeah. No, I don't know how many of them are still around, but you see it a little bit in the other presentation. I think I took it out of this one. I did take it out of this one, but it's got some nice quotes from like Mark Zuckerberg. And he's like, yeah, I had no idea people would be so evil to each other. Yeah.
Justice Department wanted to destroy IBM and AT&T.
Yeah. And Microsoft.
The number of companies that have surpassed that just since 2000.
Yeah, no.
Being one of them, being right on the top.
No, that's right. And so but the law is on sort of the social media company side. And so there's the 1996 Telecommunications Act, Section 230 is how it's talked about. It's a liability shielding law. So what happens on Facebook's not responsible, and that's in the law. And so Facebook, Meta executives have testified like 30-something times since 2016. No law regulating. We have no national cybersecurity law in the United States. European Union does, and that's a model that California follows. For example, different states and cities. I think it's Cambridge, Mass. has you can't use facial recognition in criminal proceedings because there's bias. So, yeah, no, I think there is sort of again, and this is where I think the joy I had co-writing with a computer scientist is we brought in different perspectives, and so one of the takeaways we learned a lot from each other, even though we were trying to think about similar things. But it's a team sport, and so the push has been we all wanted STEM majors, and which is important, but you have to have the humanities dimension to sort of understand what motivates people, or in AI how people learn, because they're teaching machines to think like humans, and there's learning theory that kind of goes into it. And that kind of says the limits, with respect to sort of, what's possible with AI. Because even though it's a great, one of the stories we tell in the book that my colleague was very much excited about was the chess playing Turk. I forget. There's a real word for it. But this was, this automatic Turk, might have just been automatic Turk, master chess person, grandmaster. And then it turned out it was somebody hiding in the thing. But it gave the illusion that machines can solve all our problems. And so my biggest worry is we sort of just defer too much to the machines, because they're all filled right with bias, and they're a reflection of us, right, good and bad. And so we just have to make sure the good comes out more.
On a larger scale, you mentioned earlier that your job is the good guys to stay ahead of the bad guys, but since then you've given quite a few examples of bad guys winning.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just wondering, what assurances you can give us that this is getting real good.
Yeah, I mean, the lights, right, you walk, right, you flip a light switch, lights come on, you turn the tap, the water comes out, your car works. I think that would be the best, example, that happens. And again, I don't think it's not a government problem, is what I would say. Companies. So when you start looking at incentives to improve cybersecurity, some of the highest I would say are probably companies, because they don't want their products to be flawed, right, and break. Government, as I said, has been very late. Government has been extremely reluctant because of the fear of stifling innovation. And this has sort of let some companies off the hook, so to speak. But I go back to the story I told in the other group was, so in 2020, so Russian foreign intelligence compromised a software company, SolarWinds. 3 years later, so just this past summer, the government indicted the chief information security officer for fraud, because he said you made misleading statements about how secure SolarWinds was. SolarWinds just filed a counter complaint saying, hey, look, we clearly disclosed we can't defend ourselves against an advanced persistent threat from Russian intelligence. And so I think depending on how this case shakes out, whether the government gets involved. But I think it's a reasonable ask that we don't expect companies to defend themselves against foreign intelligence services. I think that's reasonable. So then whose job is it? And then it would be FBI has counterintelligence domain in the United States, CIA external, but the system isn't set up that way. And that's I think one of the challenges in this field. And then you throw on the worker shortage, right? Did I say there's 500,000 to 750,000 open jobs? And so my pitch for those listening, because I get the question sometimes too, well, why would I want to go to work for Cyber Command and not Google? Right? Google has a free yogurt and better pay and all that kind of stuff. And I said, yeah, that's true. But you work for the federal government. Your quality of life is better. It's 40 hours a week. You work more than that, you get paid overtime. 2, you become a licensed hacker with legal authority behind you. And, because hacking is illegal in the United States. And so that's kind of why you do it. And then, 3, I don't know, this generation, I don't want to make a generational comment because I've got people in this generation. So, but it's harder, the patriotism is less so. But people just see the big money in IT companies. And I'm like, you should see, I spent 33 years in the Navy. You should see the authority we give 19-year-olds. Never get it again. It's remarkable.
Yes, sir. A bit of a technical sort of question, but the world is running out of IPv4s.
Yeah.
Moving to IPv6. Are they more secure than before?
I don't know. I mean, the one thing is, people have a better understanding of cybersecurity, so I think there'll be efforts. To change it a little bit, your question, the premise, China, for example, has proposed just a new internet protocol with security built in from the ground up. And you might say, why would we be opposed to that? Right? Security implies control, right, to reinforce authoritarianism. And so this is where, when we wade into these international discussions, because it's not just a US only discussion. And so this is where it gets, very complicated. The US, for example, signed on to the Budapest Convention, which is about cybercrime, prevent child exploitation online, easy. We didn't sign on to the prevent racism online. Why? Because we said it right violates First Amendment, and our European partners alike, right? But in Germany, it's illegal to march with a Nazi flag. In the United States, it's viewed as an expression of the First Amendment, and so this is where you start kind of blending, law, culture, technology, to try to get at some of these things. AI is a better one. People know we've got 30 years of bad cybersecurity, so they're trying to think about AI. How do we build in guardrails now? But people are right. The motto, I think Facebook, right? Move fast and break things. I think that's the motto.
Other questions?
The only example that you gave of Western nations using cybersecurity offensively is the Iranian centrifuges. Then you talk about rooms full of workers in China, North Vietnam, North Korea. Does the No Such Agency also have rooms full of hackers who are using those? And what kinds of things are they working on?
Yeah, so so some key structural differences first. So I would say, so you could go to the NSA website and you'll see it's right. They collect political and military intelligence. Is kind of what they do. And then on the cybercom front, what they would be doing is looking for vulnerabilities that in the event of conflict, they could use. Vulnerabilities disappear when you update your software. And so they're constantly looking for those in case, one day the Secretary of Defense calls and says, hey, we need you to cyberize something. But like in the case of, like in China, they have state-owned enterprises. And so the old adage is there's two kind of companies in the United States, those hacked by China, those don't know they've been hacked by China. So I'm glad that still gets a laugh because I thought it was getting long. But but like in seriousness, the intellectual property theft is ginormous. And so their intelligence service can easily give it what they take to their state-owned enterprises because their government is one and the same. In the U.S., if NSA would hack into Huawei and get their new phone design, who do they give it to? Do they give it to Apple? Do they give it to Samsung Korean? But how do you who do you give it to? And so that's kind of one of the structural differences. But but NSA is about national security narrowly defined, political intelligence, military intelligence, not economic. And the deal that Obama and Xi had struck in 2013-ish. If you read the communique closely, it said neither country will target each other for commercial value. In other words, we will target each other for political military value. And then since China has sort of ramped back up on the economic espionage for commercial value. Mostly, as I said, so, the U.S., holds itself to stricter legal standards as well. Congressional oversight is pretty significant when it comes to intelligence because of past abuses. And then I would say, legally within the Defense Department, the lawyers are wonderful to ensure that, the U.S. does comply with the law of armed conflict. And that's not true, in other countries.
Back in the 1970s and 80s, it's hard to remember that the bad actors that was Japan, they were kicking our ass in so many things in industrial. A consortium of companies was put together called Sematech, and it was unusual because we were bringing competitors together to basically come up with something that was going to take on the Japanese. Is that going on today that we don't know about?
Yeah, so a lot of different levels. Politically, as I said, Nate Fick is our U.S. ambassador to cyberspace. So he works with his counterparts, around the world, but mostly sort of Western Europe, Japan, South Korea, North America, to look for international norms. What I would say the new wrinkle, it's companies are banding together against governments. So Microsoft, for example, proposed a digital Geneva Convention as a way to hold governments, because they sort of, when they look at sort of the threat landscape in cyberspace, they see, individual hackers, they see criminal enterprises, they see intelligence services, they see military commands. So Microsoft has been promoting this Digital Geneva Convention to at least move governments off the problem list. In Germany, the company Siemens, they produce a lot of things, but the industrial control systems is the main thing. They have something they call the Charter of Trust. And so what they've been doing, again, is to try to get band companies together to prevent governments from targeting industrial control systems. So that would be probably the wrinkle. But maybe the last thing I would say too is, the U.S. has an outside voice in this because U.S. tech companies lead the world. And so when Microsoft decides something, it affects the world, right? Amazon Web Services. I think even on the SolarWinds hack I mentioned, I don't know if they were using Amazon Web Services, but Russian intelligence, they were using US-based servers. Why? Cheap and faster. So this, again, changes how you think about this problem. You're not even worried about, from Russia. They could be in Russia, but they're using stuff here in the United States. And that legally, from an intelligence perspective, gets really, really messy. But that's why I think companies, Microsoft runs an amazing threat operations center. So it's monitoring traffic. It knows stuff. I mean, I would say, because the question I got with high school students was about government. I'm like, I would rather go to Microsoft, to be honest, for a lot of things. I think they know more, what's going on. CrowdStrike, too. They know more what's going on because they're global as well.
All right, thank you very much.
All right, I survived. Okay.